Hi there, and welcome to the screencast on exposure in still photography. Today we're going to look at aperture, shutter speed, and ISO. We'll learn how these controls affect exposure and what effect adjusting these controls will have on your photos. The amount of light entering the camera and how it reacts with the sensors within the camera is controlled by these three settings: aperture, shutter speed, and ISO. Each of these controls can vary the exposure of a shot, but each of them also has its own effect on the quality of the image. Let's start with aperture. This decides how wide the iris of the camera opens, much like the pupils in our eyes. The wider it opens, the more light is let into the camera, and the smaller the aperture, the less light is let in. It's controlled in f-stops, and any given lens will have a maximum and a minimum f-stop. If you are using a zoom lens, then the maximum and minimum f-stop will change depending on which zoom setting you will use. If you zoom the lens in, the minimum f-stop will be reduced. As well as altering the amount of light entering the camera, changing the aperture alters the depth of field of the camera. The depth of field is the portion of an image which is in focus. Small f-stop numbers signify a wide aperture. This will result in a shallower depth of field. A higher f-stop number signifies a narrower aperture. This creates a wider depth of field, meaning more of the image is in focus. Look at the two photos. You can see the background is clear in one, but blurry in the other. The shallower depth of field in the blurry background was created by using a wide aperture with a fast shutter speed. The image with the wider depth of field and the unblurred background was created by using a small aperture and a slow shutter speed. If we're changing the aperture, we have to change the shutter speed to compensate for the change in exposure. So, if you want to alter the depth of field, adjust the aperture. Shutter speed. This allows you to control how long the shutter stays open when you take a picture. The longer the shutter stays open, the more light is let into the camera. This is why we had to increase the shutter speed when we reduced the aperture. Shutter speed is all to do with movement. The faster the shutter speed, the sharper the camera will catch movement. As you can see from the two shots, one has captured the water mid-flow and the other has blurred the flow of water. The sharp focus of the moving water has been achieved by using a fast shutter speed of 1/250th of a second. The blurring has occurred because we used a slower shutter speed of 1/40th of a second. We have controlled the exposure by altering the aperture. So, if you want to capture very fast movement with a sharp focus, you have to use a sharp shutter speed. If you're looking for a desired effect of blurred movement, then you can lower your shutter speed and that will allow you to create that effect. ISO. This determines how sensitive the camera's sensor is to light. The higher the ISO number, the more sensitive to light the sensor is. Being more sensitive means we can use smaller apertures and faster shutter speeds. There is a trade-off, however. The higher the ISO number, the more grain and noise you will see in the image. Take a look at the two images. One was shot using a much higher ISO value than the other. The exposure remained constant because we changed the shutter speed from 0.8 seconds to 1/40th of a second. The higher ISO value has created a lot of noise in the picture. This is not a desirable effect, but if you're shooting in low light, you might only have a choice of increasing the ISO or the shutter speed. So if you don't want blurry movement, you will have to increase the ISO. Use the lowest ISO setting for any given light. Decide whether you want your f-stop or your shutter speed to be your priority and adjust the ISO accordingly. You need to understand what effect each of these controls is having on the picture you're going to take. Decide whether you want to control the shutter speed or the aperture. Once you've made that decision, you can adjust the ISO setting to allow you to use the aperture and shutter setting speed that you want. That brings us to the end of the screencast on exposure in still photography. You should now have a better understanding of how aperture, shutter speed, and ISO affect exposure, and also how each of these individual controls affects the look of a shot. See you all next time.